Welcome back to our study in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. This week we are in 1st Thessalonians chapter 4. We are going to do the first two paragraphs. There are three paragraphs in 1st Thessalonians 4. This video is going to be for the first two of those, and then another video for the last paragraph on its own, because it can be the one that messes people up a lot, and it's something that we need to pause a lot longer on and make sure that I discuss it in a little more detail than I sometimes do with these chapters. So, that being said, we start out with Paul. This chapter, if you've been with us from the beginning, chapter 1 was kind of encouragement. Chapter 2 was more about the situation that Paul kind of found himself in. 3 is about how he responded to Timothy's message and why he's sending Timothy back. And now chapter 4 is the things that Paul really wants to make sure that the Thessalonian church learns. This is the chapter of instruction in this short book. So it's three paragraphs. Each one is a different kind of instruction. And I think the way I read this, and a number of scholars do this, so I can't take a lot of credit for it, for this being original. This is me learning from other people. But it seems like the first issue that Paul talks about is the least important. The next issue is slightly more important. And then the third issue is really where the Thessalonian community is struggling. And so Paul kind of moves in an order of progressively getting more important. Each one of these instructions is more important than the last one. So he begins with the idea that he wants to encourage people in the Lord Jesus, and to say that he gave them instructions through Jesus. Now, this is kind of important because Paul would have known the Hebrew scriptures really, really well. He would have known the teachings of Jesus well. But again, as we said earlier in these videos, the Thessalonian community would not have had access to written scriptures. So they would not have known anything about Jesus other than what Paul has told them. This letter is the first piece of written literature that this church probably had. It is certainly the first piece of what would become the Bible that this congregation has ever seen. Most of this congregation. Some of them may have been Jews who would have had access to some of this in the synagogue, but honestly, they broke off from the synagogue, so they don't have access to these scriptures. And even if they did, I doubt any of them could have read the scriptures if they were in Hebrew, although they might have been using Greek, and so maybe they would have had some people. But this is still, a lot of this is oral. A lot of this is word of mouth. And Paul wants to remind them of that he is the one who has gotten instruction from Jesus, or from Jesus's followers, from the scriptures. And he's not saying this of his own accord. This is this is how he has interpreted the message of Jesus, and he wants to interpret it for them. And the first real issue, we don't know what it means, but it's about sexual immorality. Now, this can mean a lot of things. There's a wide range of meanings for this verse. So it is important to understand that simply because we see this word does not mean we know exactly what was going on in the Thessalonian community. There are some possibilities. It is possible that an individual was having illicit relationships that we would call adultery or something along those lines, although it's not entirely likely. That's not necessarily the biggest threat. In fact, it seems more likely that what is happening is that an individual is frequenting a brothel or some sort of prostitution, which not only would that have been a violation of the sexual ethic that Paul talks about, it also would have had some religious implications behind it to visit the brothel, because they frequently had temple implications. And so it very well could be that an individual was continuing to frequent a brothel even after he became a Christian. Now, this is not for certain, and there's no way to know. But it does seem likely that Paul is dealing with a very real situation. It would be very unlikely that Paul would ever deal with a situation in the hypothetical, at least like this, um, since paper, writing materials, let's use that word, writing materials were very scarce, fairly expensive. You wanted to use as little of it as possible. So you wrote out what was important to you. And to waste a whole paragraph on something that the Thessalonian church was not struggling with is a lot less likely than to say this was in some way a real issue for the Thessalonian community and that they were struggling in a way that he needed to address it. It is very likely that the individual who is struggling with the sexual immorality is not only showing a bad influence for Christians in the community, but also probably negatively impacting the church because he is either trying to advocate for his lifestyle in a way that is inappropriate, or being a temptation to people, also inappropriate. There's a lot of negative possibilities here, but it definitely seems like Paul wants to come across very strongly that what is going on is not necessary and should be eliminated. I do like the idea also that this is one of those times where Paul is speaking to the community. He's speaking to the whole Thessalonian church, but the people who are guilty will know that they are guilty. In other words, he doesn't have to write a section to these individuals that says, hey, I know what you're doing and you need to stop it. He can say it to the community. Remember, this is wrong. This is not how we are to act, and you need to get into line. It can be addressed to the whole community and not singling out the people who are actually guilty, which can go a long way towards productivity. Now, I know Paul is not in any way shy about writing to the individuals when that is needed, but I like how he handles this, what I would consider in a much more pastoral way, where he does not call out the person for the sin. Instead, he just says, hey, don't reject this teaching because it's not just from me. It's not just my way of thinking. This is exactly what God has for us. And then he goes on in the second paragraph. He kind of just leaves it. He said, this is wrong. We don't want this. But if you can just listen to me. And as you listen to me, you're not just listening to me, you're listening to God who gave us this instruction. And then he just changes subjects. And he says, you don't need me to tell you about loving others. You know how to love others. And this is amazing. I mean, I love this. This is wonderful for Paul to say to this church. You don't need me to talk to you about how to love other people. You know how to do that. You're good at it. What you need to remember, though, is that as you're loving others, remember to love those outside of the community. You're really good about showing love to those inside, but remember to show love to those outside of the community. And one of the ways that you can show love outside of the community and kind of show who we are to the people who are outside of the community is by not picking fights, not being lazy, not being busybodies, not picking fights, going about your business. Now, we tend to think about this in terms of laziness and idleness. We tend to think about this passage in terms of Paul's telling them that they have to work because they're being lazy, and he's bringing up how he was a tent maker in this time. Now, he was a tent maker and he did work. He set up a stall in Thessalonica. It is likely, and he tells us in the book of Philippians, that the Philippian church paid for most of his missionary journey to Thessalonica. Paul seems to have gotten a lot of money from them, and his tent making probably did not pay the bills. It was probably more of a way for him to meet people in the community and have conversations than it was for him to make serious money. So he's not really addressing the idea of work versus laziness. He is talking about the idea of working for what is appropriate, what is right, against maybe being just a lazily indulged by the patron in this community. A patron might bolster one of a number of people, and what he and kind of use them for political pawns, and get them to do errands for them, all sorts of things. It'd be like a wealthy billionaire hiring a bunch of personal assistants today. Um, and Paul is kind of lashing out at that kind of that job as being a personal assistant for the wealthy, as much as he is about being lazy and not working, because in that community, very few people did not work, and only the people who could not work didn't work. There was no social welfare like there is today. So to put this into social welfare kinds of terms is not appropriate. In fact, what he seems to be really addressing is the idea that do not cause persecution on yourself. Don't go out to the community around you and pick fights with people who aren't believers. If they don't like you, that's fine. If they persecute you, that's fine. But don't go out and like drum up persecution. Don't go out and be the busybody that is constantly getting into other people's affairs and constantly telling them what to do and constantly telling them how they're not living up to your standard. Don't do that. They're outside the church. Don't pick fights. You're going to be persecuted enough as is. You don't have to go out and make yourselves obnoxious. That seems to be one of the things that he is really driving home here, because he's talking about work in contrast to love, or similar to love, and their actions being in contrast to both. The idleness, the busybodiness is in contrast to both love of the community and the outsiders, and in contrast to work. So the idea being that this community of faith has kind of sought fights ever since Jason was arrested and Paul was thrown out of the city. They've kind of picked fights with the Jewish synagogue, and Paul's saying, "Don't do that. Make sure we have a great reputation." And when you're working that way, then you are truly loving Christ in the way that I know you already do. And that's where we're going to leave this. Then we're going to come back at verse 13 and pick up Christ's return in the next video. As always, if you have questions or comments, please send them to me. I'd love to hear how you're experiencing the text. And until we meet again, God bless.